Um, May I start? Yeah. Hello and welcome back to Spielart Festival at Bellevue di Monaco, live here in front of a small audience and also live at home in the stream. We started the thematic focus on climate justice yesterday with speeches and intervention by Alton Krenak, an indigenous rights activist from Brazil, Amanda Pina, choreographer of Danza y Frontera, Alessandro Cuesta, anthropologist from Mexico City, and the Munich-based photographer Arno Trümper. Today, we will move up north and start with a talk and film screening by Paulina Feodorov, a Skolt Sami activist and artist living in the Finnish-Russian borderlands. In a discussion with Eva Neklaeva, she will outline how her artistic and activistic work and practice against the results of climate change are connected. We will then proceed, after a short break, with a talk by Olufemi Taiwo on climate colonialism and climate reparations in a discussion with Molemo Moiloa. And in the third part of the afternoon, we will screen the short film The River Is Me, a portrait of the first river worldwide, located in New Zealand, that was given a legal personhood. And that will follow after the two longer speeches. And in the end of the day, we will finally arrive at poems by Naomi Ortiz. She lives between Mexican borderlands and US-American borderlands and fights for climate change, eco and social justice, just as well as for disability rights. And we will hear through her poetry how these are all connected. I wish you an interesting afternoon. And now to Paulina. Thank you.
Spässä manan ja spässä kuli levet ovemu teich. Mun omli temmersa ärtsep semmän lähdä päällä ja läm shevat järjest shottam ja täipen jaam ja on teidän myytyjä Helsingistä. Ja toivon tiitä syökä päivä pukita. Thank you for having me here today. It seems to be that you have started from the other part of the Earth's lungs yesterday, going with the southern sphere, and now we are taking a step to the Nordic or North Arctic parts of planetary's way of breathing. I guess we are living now, witnessing a time when in a global and local spheres, the understanding and practicing how the planetary systems are really functioning and how should we collaborate with them is re-emerging. I have prepared some thoughts of you, but I thought that I maybe would start speaking a bit about ice and Arctic, since the most defining feature that comes from the Arctic cultures and Arctic lands is the slowness. In Arctic, everything is slow. The slowness of growth, the slowness of decomposing, and the slowness of the time that areas are awake in a year. Living with ice and snow means that around 8 months every year, the land is more or less hibernating. And coming from that realization, the whole culture is filled with different kind of practices, how to deal with its loneliness. Some even say that ice is the material form of a dream. That is the cover that brings dream alive. Arctic, as other areas in the globe, are now heavily bombarded with different kind of interests. And maybe the reason why Arctic is now the final frontier, finally open for industrial interests, that due to the hard and harsh ice and snow, the harsh and impenetrable dream, the area has been until now hardly reachable, and therefore it has been easier to have a grab of the areas that are in a southern or more central sphere of the globe. Even though everybody is filled with different kind of science articles and scientific estimations and that form of speaking, I would still wish to use around 5 minutes to go through just quickly what the latest science is saying about Arctic in their own terms. I wish to do this because these definitions that science, especially from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, but also this new climate emergency advisory group led by the Sir David King, is pushing forward, gives us a glimpse and an understanding what kind of strategies or implementations are going to be used in a quite near future in the area that is a home for over 4 million different peoples that have been living here for the last 10,000 years, some of us with continuation cultures from ever since. Arctic is seen now from the science point of view, something that the indigenous peoples have been saying for a very long time, that Arctic is one of the earth regulating systems, one of the systems that regulates the whole earth. It currently melts 3 times faster than anywhere else in the planet. Scientific community is now saying that urgent Arctic repair is needed to ensure world remaining habitable for all of us. When ice melts rapidly in Arctic, system changes from cooling white ice that has been bouncing the solar radiation away from the globe. It changes from that cooling white ice into self-warming black ice, which means that black ice starts to bind even more heat and pacify the warming. A scientific community has now identified 15 different kind of climate elements, and from those 15, 9 are currently unstable and on verge of collapsing. One of those is a jet stream system, which regulates the circular motion of hot and cool air in globe. The natural cycle of jet streams has been more or less oval. Is this oval circular or oval? But due to the warming, the circulation the circulation pattern has started to change, and also there has been blockades in the jet streams, meaning that the hot air can, for instance, happened in Canada the last summer. The hot air gets blocked in one certain area and doesn't move away. So jet stream slowdown triggering so-called Rossby waves and weather blockage. Then the Arctic Sea ice reduction, permafrost thawing, Greenland's ice sheet loss accelerating, boreal forests firing and pests changing, and Atlantic circulation in slowdown since 1950s, which is changing, for instance, monsoon systems and the Gulf Stream. Amazon rainforests having frequent droughts, coral reef dying off large scale, and the ice loss of West and Eastern Antarctic ice sheet accelerating. So these are the 9 different climate elements that the scientific community has agreed upon, and they seem to be having there's this scientific term called tipping point, and following the point of after which there is no return of one of those climatical elements to recover from the cumulative effects that have been causing the change in the patterns. And as I said, 9 of those are currently unstable. And what this chain reaction of those climatic elements collapsing causes, no one is really able to say. 1/3 of the soil-based carbon is still here in Arctic, trapped on the ground, bind on the ground. And like said, Arctic forests and peatlands, especially here in northern Fennoscandia, which is the mild version of the Arctic, since we don't have the harsh climatical circumstances as Siberia or Alaska would face, or Greenland, that the marsh mires and old growth forests are similar lungs for our systems of reproductivity as Amazonian rainforests are for the southern sphere. No, last words from the scientists. Since it seems to be that the current political system, who is very aware that a big systematic change is needed, can outline 2 goals or questions. How can we reduce emissions as fast as possible? And secondly, start preparing for the future. And from that latter pathway, how to start preparing for the future, our paths starts to differ in a very different directions. Big nation states, big influential states such as US, UK, China, Russia, are wishing to have secure the blocking of emissions or binding of emissions with 3 different approaches. First is technological approaches, for instance, creating artificial carbon traps or solidifying carbon again from the air. That is already been done. Second is forced location of population, which is also already been done at some scale, so-called climate refugees, which is how do you say it, kind of a term that wishes to make what is about a bit nicer, that if a whole region is becoming inhabitable, we just call people who are able to leave the region, we just call them climate refugees. And the third and the last and the most paradoxal or conflict tendency or option that creates most conflicts is the reductions in populations. For instance, United States is very powerfully advocating for fast transition into nuclear power, nuclear energy, to get away from the carbon emissions. And it seems to be that the ongoing outline is that this reduction must be done so that the foundation of the capitalistic economies is not to be touched or not to be moved, and expectations are really high from finding out a technological solution for that. One of the hot potatoes of that kind of a technological discussions is geoengineering, which means the modification of the climate. That is already being done, for instance, locally by in situations there are big sport events or concerts that you can push artificially rain clouds away, for instance. But now in a big scale trend, there are discussions about refreezing the Arctic using cloud manipulation. Especially Russia and China are actively already doing such climate modification issues, and this is something that splits the scientific community, but also the rare areas where the indigenous peoples are able to have their say in different platforms. This is something that is a big divider in our political approaches, how to create climate justice. In a bigger discussions, we are saying that we are now on the path of 2 Celsius increase of global temperatures, but in the Cape areas or calotte areas, as the Arctic and Antarctic are, the rise of the temperature is now from 6 to 8 Celsius degrees. And that would mean, for instance, the rise of sea level for over 100 meters. And just to conclude the scientific part, or the short introduction of the latest talks in Arctic, I would like to conclude that the southern species are already coming up north. The ground species are approaching north around 27 kilometers per year, and the sea species are a bit faster, approaching 36 kilometers per year. So, from this background, what can a woman of my age, 44 years old, Skolt-Sami theater director, do when our people, Skolt-Sami people, have already went through the total damage or total collapse of everything that we know about 70 years ago after the Second World War, when we lost almost all of our land areas to the mining industry, and finally were forcibly located from our traditional areas to area that is now called Finland. We are still recovering from that big blow, and I think it is a shared experience within our people that we have already witnessed an apocalypse. We have already seen the end of the world, since the mining industry in those areas has left areas of it's a nature scientific term of full destruction, areas in a state of full destruction in a quite big terms. The very same nickel that is now the major element for the green boom, for instance, electric car batteries, Teslas and so forth, but also for the equipment that is now making possible for us to meet in a digital form, whether it be computer or mobile telephone. The nickel is a crucial element for making those batteries more sustainable, or not sustainable, having a long life. The Sápmi, which is the home area of the Sami, that covers the areas of nation state of Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia in the Kola Peninsula, is ongoing a huge nickel reservation mining boom, exploration boom, and at least in the Swedish side of Sápmi, the new green term is to say that these are locally harvested minerals, that it would be good for the Nordic societies to have locally harvested minerals for their own use rather than going to third world countries. And yes, obviously that is true, since the modern day colonialism usually pushes all those industrial initiatives from the global, so-called global north to global south. But in the same time, in the context of Finland and Sweden and Russia, the ownership of the indigenous Sami lands is still unclear, that who owns the land. We have never signed off our land rights away to the nation states. So that structural, slow-paced land capture and seize is reality. It's a very acute and lived reality in all of our 4 countries. And coming from that understanding, the recent years I've been in my own artistic practice trying to find a ways of, first of all, buy my people more time, buy our land use practices more time, and buy myself more time. It has been a combination of different kind of activism, collaboration with nature conservation organizations such as Greenpeace, but also forms of different kind of art projects, since they are the only projects that are being funded in order to ensure or secure Sami land rights, or even to map the damage that has been already done, has been possible through art. And the introduction part of which I would like to conclude by showing a map from the last art project that we are doing, which is called What Forms Can Atonement Take?, which is mapping the cumulative impacts of industrial land use in just one of the Sami reindeer herds communities area. Compared to Central Europe, the areas that are up north are quite big, since Europe is so densely populated and the agriculture has taken over the Europe so long time ago. But when we remember that we are in the Arctic region, and the amount of space that a single, for instance, a reindeer or whatever animal or mammal needs to have in able to have its needs for nutrition fulfilled is much larger. And even though that we are semi-nomadic people still, Sami have never gone in a full-scale agricultural practices. So we are somehow a strange combination of nomadism, Stone Age hunter-gatherer society and the post-industrial generations that are fully bound in this modern world. But I do not know that there would have been ever, for instance, a Sami mine or a Sami pulp industry, or Sami initiated some other forms of energy production or land use. That something in our culture, even though we have been having a contact with the Nordic civilization for more than 1,000 years, something is still so strong that the very core, even very scattered, is still prevailing. So I wish if I can just share my screen for a moment, I will show you the map of that one reindeer herding cooperative's land use change from the 1940s to last year. If these green dots are old growth forests, which is the home base for the reindeer and its peoples, we can see that after the Second World War, over 60% of those forests have been logged. Finland is one of the very few countries in the world, maybe the only one, who has paid their war repatriations. That meant that since Finland was the loser of the Second World War, those deaths, war repatriations were paid with pulp industry. So the main product for those forests that have been prevailing since the last ice age has been toilet paper. Have I now speaking too long time, or do you want to hop in, Eva? Or would it be the time to show the second film?
I think it would be great to show the film. Thank you.
Yeah,
if
let's
that's
do that.
Also fine for you. Great, thanks.
Täten yhteisöokasta leijä iäskvellisellen päikkeleen ja
Tähän leijä koko teko tän jytkäs leijä iäskvellisellen päikkenä. Tämä oli meiltä päitimeltä halli leijä nyt ja leijätä päitikosta. Koska istas temposia tahtli tommeni jälstä. Pääsaakin kuin voimme saada johte kutsap koskas tietenkin kun lehni. Hälti, että jället saavil mähtö toppen perittiä ja jälstä mähtö kolle. Tätä kuulumisia jälle järjessä mistä naapurin ja toin. Kuuntlemin ja tonokmen koijemmin, mähtö umma jälle ja mähtö aina.
No tällähän vonna sieka säimelämmäs ne jäni nyettelän tahalja pukraajat
Nythän ne oli tein ne pytteet toppen mieltä tein vaitsuvaltaksi säivethän tietenkin nyethän lää vaikeampi jo että lasko sen verran. Mutta puhtehan töitse. Färtihän puhtet mainnehan on vielskuet kuitenkin. Ja sitten kyllä selm saivausta kostakselle, et kostevakselle. Tai toppenhan ei tiedä, toppenhan lää uummin puhjohtahan sille kostvain ja puhtiitte kost. Ja teit puhteli jytsä ja vaitsamni säimme peitse. Mä koummin leijetak tilat leijetak. Ihan usein tunnorskoittoon puhutam tietäm töitä.
No joutaiko käskään seitsvapparasta ei taas se perre?
No totta se mainste seitsvapparinhan mange jo mainstelle teippissit. Soeppä aina mähtaukleet ja toppenhan ne uetskuitte tiedät ja töitä.
Kiikosta seuja tän kuellisellen päihkellä.
Ja kokleet jäi sellem saa ja tahkanen tästä vatsa tiedät.
Joen kun perkasi. Katos kalat kaikki. Mistä lomppuilla?
Joo.
Ja kaltaat lämmästä hallitusta.
Joo, ja tähän lään okaan, joku jortamenta kuutsit, vaikka johtem töissä.
Eikö vuosi?
Vuosi.
Joo.
Si manga puku ähpiä.
Oho.
Joo, se oli semmonen
Tästä
ajatus, että
Katos kaikki sieltä lompoloista, niistä järvestä.
ja vedenpinta on niin paljon laskenut, että niillä se uupelu on tullut piiloon.
Muistatko Risto tällaista kesää, että näin kuiva on?
Ei, kyllä minun ei koskaan.
Entäs lati?
Ei, kyllä se on tämä semmonen. Niin. Minä muistan, kun se Anna mummokin sanoi, kun minä hänen kanssaan siellä joella kesäkalastin, niin lohista puhuttiin, että sitten jos lohi lakkaa olemasta, niin sanoi, niin kuin hän oli sitä kalastajasukua, oli merikalastaja ja lohenkalastaja. Sanoi, että emme me ole sitten enää ihmisiä, jos lohikaan ei tänne tulisi, että mehän kuolemme sen kalan matkassa. Että se joka vuosi piti se joku kala saada. Että silloin hän tuntee itsensä että eläväksi ja ylväksi, koska minä vielä pystyn sen lohen saamaan. Että sitten lakkaan olemasta, kun en saa enää. En kykene joelle menemään. Niin se sanoi, että sitten ihminen lakkaa olemasta. Päässä pähkäs. Sanoi, että kiitos muori, että annoit tämän kalan.
Paulina, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great. Hi. Thank you for this talk and thank you for sharing this short documentary. I have a lot of questions. How much time do we have? 20 minutes? About? Right, okay. Okay, thank you. It's also a beautiful picture that you have as your background. So you, Paulina, you are a Sami woman from Skolt community, and it's a community that was forcefully evacuated, relocated from the territory that is now Russian territory to Finland after the Second World War, as a result of Finnish state losing parts of the territories to the Soviet Union, and this nation, this community, was relocated to Finland and lost its ancestral lands, but preserved a lot of its culture and a lot of its traditions, and including this unique way of governing, the governance body which is called SIDA, Council, right, and which is still active as a way to self-govern, and I think this gives a lot of this gives a lot of energy to your work as an activist, as an artist, very much based on the way of governing and all the way of kind of changing the legal systems. And I know that you have been one of the advocates for the process which is called the Truth and Reconciliation process between the Sami and the Finnish state. That kind of this, and you said once, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually a lot of ecological problems that we have, one of the roots of the ecological crisis is actually in the constitution, which gives legal rights to humans, but not to the lands and not to the animals, and that this tradition of governance of Sami comes from this deep understanding of alliance between humans, lands and animals. Could you talk a bit about this process and how it has been developing in the past years, and how let's say both of your practices as your practice and how you use it, how you apply it to different systems of fields of activism and art and politics have been, what kind of impact it has had during the past period. Am I clear with the question?
Yeah, I try to answer. Thank you, Eva. Maybe I start with that. Now, when the eco crisis and climate crisis and so many fundamental changes and crises are facing all the societies, not only just the so-called marginal societies that has been object of robbery or violence or massacre or cultural or straightforward genocide for hundreds of years. Now the same mechanisms are imposed to larger societies as well, since we are running out of resources globally. And even though we wouldn't be running out of resources, still the climate change is questioning the power of old wealth as well, since the sea rise level is happening for instance, to Venice, which is the 1,600 years old city and central of European commerce, and it's a fortress that is now drowning, and no pile of money can save it alone. You need to have the knowledge how to help the nature's own systems to heal as well. And since this is happening, a big, I could also say, a mega trend within the art has been in recent years of imagining different kind of futures, trying to find out different kind of approaches by imagining. And at the same time, what I know, or what I don't know, but I have monitored the difference coming from the indigenous culture, even that has been so much eroded and scattered, the knowledges that we still have. But the fundamental difference of understanding the imagination or understanding that what kind of futures we think is that I'm not only speaking on my behalf, even I only have right to speak on behalf of myself, but the other indigenous activists and artists and academics that I have been with, that the foundation of thinking of how the ways forward comes from the understanding how nature functions, what nature is, how she manifests herself. And for instance, Haudenosaunee thinkers have said that the imagination is one of the most fundamental ways of communicating with the old growth lands. That the imagination is something that is not never a separate from the land that you are from. It is the way or a sensitivity that comes from the land. So I think that through all of those hardships and losses, I have been also blessed to come from a culture that still has this endemic form of governance, because that form of governance is based on the ways and methodologies how to communicate with the land rather than how to communicate with taxation or how to communicate with trade deals. Obviously, it has human systems included, since it is always an alliance between man and nature, a human being and a nature, and the other living beings, since we are territorial mammals, even though our current form of culture would not support that thought. But understanding that we are territorial mammals, that everybody needs to have their own pace and everybody needs to have certain resources to have food and shelter in a systems that are, if the natural systems are lived with correctly, they are able to renew themselves endlessly. So that our Sida self-governance that might have been a model for all the Sami tribes, since Sami home area is 2,000 kilometers long, and it involves, for instance, now 9 spoken languages. But maybe due to the geographical location, our Sida system was the last functioning one, and its self-rule in a full scale in 1944, which is not that long time ago. And just to say that when we were forcibly evacuated, Skoltsami has had their traditional areas also in an area that is nowadays called Norway, and also we have our traditional lands in area called Finland. So our tribe from the Suonjel was forcibly located to the old winter pastures of Njautam-Sida, which is also a part of the Skoltsami tribe, but they just had a different area. And that area was empty because in the 1800s, a group of Kvens, the Finns that came to exile due to the hunger, they wanted to come closer to the ocean, the Arctic Barents Ocean. With different kind of a border arrangement between Norway and Russia, they pushed the Scout Sami away from that area, so there was space to go. And those winter pastures that were in the now newly independent Finnish side of the area we were located into. So everything I do is trying to build up and strengthen those bits and pieces and reconnect those dots, since when still functioning, the Sida system was a source of sustainable living with the man and the land. There is no historical evidence showing that due to this Sida system of governance, area would have been overused or harvested too extensively. So jumping into the question about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or committee that Finland has agreed to by the then sitting Prime Minister Juha Sipilä, who didn't bind the other parties to share their understanding what is this doing. So we are in a process that we are starting a process that no one really knows about where it is going, and that has also left a window of opportunities to open for the Samis in Finland to, even though that voice would not be heard, but to frame and write our own point of view, that why do we wish to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and what do we want from that? And the push that we have been trying to give forward is that the current industrial exploitation that is done without the consent of the Sami communities must halt. It must end. And that would be not only right in a human rights perspective, it would be not juridically only right, but that would be also the easiest and the softest and the cheapest form of Finland fulfilling its climate demands with carbon sinks, since the last remaining old growth forests that are a huge carbon sink in Finland or Fennoscandia in general are in a Sami home area.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Okay. Actually, when you said earlier, what am I, a woman of my age can do? I mean, you did amazing things by you saved the forest, or you were part of the group that saved one of the few remaining old growth forests in the Nordic territories, in the so-called conflict of Nelim forest, where a group indigenous-led group actually proved that it's possible to stop this gigantic machine of state exploitation of the land, state-driven exploitation of the land. The project that you run, which is called Snow Change, has been for years documenting the changes that are happening in the territories, uniting the community of the scientists and the indigenous community, and has proven again that bringing together these different types of knowledges can be very beneficial. This process of restoration of the river banks that we saw in the film is also like the first indigenous-led process of this type, and at the same time. it's in your artistic practice, you would be doing. Also, it's a lot of firsts. It's like the first ever indigenous-led, the first ever Sami pavilion that you would be curating with other collaborators in Venice. And I wanted to talk about these all kinds of different types of knowledges that you bring together, because for me this is very interesting. When you talk about the artistic research or the artistic type of knowledge which comes from the artistic research that touches or brings together different other types of knowledges, such as scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge. And you talk about, in one of your talks, I remember, you talked about the difference between touching and transforming, and how bringing all these knowledges together can actually transform something or have an impact. Could you talk a bit about this? How do you see this process of transformation happening?
Yeah, I can try. Again, like you said, I collaborate with many people. No one is able to do initiatives alone. If I start at the why, and how do I see my role, since I'm not even though I have reindeer mark, I'm not a reindeer herder. And even though I fish, I'm not a fisherman. I'm not that kind of a carrier of traditional knowledge. I don't live in a land. I'm trained as a theater director, and I live nowadays in Helsinki. And I went through the Western school system. But what seems to be, when sitting on many different kind of meetings, that I think it's our generation. I guess quite many recognize the feature of being the bridge generation, that being able to interpret things or ways of speaking or ways of framing things from different community to other community. And that's what I have been doing mostly, that my role is to connect people and cut the distance out of the situations. Because, like I said, the traditional world in Arctic is slow. It means that our protocols are slow, and our way of expressing things is not that big and grandiose. And a scientific community, the demand of objectivity gives the distance between people. So having a background in performing arts has led to me, it was a coincidence for me to end up working with performing arts, but it means that your biggest tool is your body, and your biggest form of communicating is to try to communicate from one body to another body. And always when there's something happening between bodies, there's a transformation of energy, and that transformation of the energy and what is the flavor and the tone of the energy has more meaning than the actual words that are exchanged. That in exchange is not about, it's not only about what you are saying. And secondly, that and I think that there's so much knowledge within the arts, how to set an environment and how to set a situation in a way that would be non-threatening, non-hostile, that could be able to create a space for, especially in the conflicted situations, to soften it up and remind ourselves that, okay, we are both these energetic creatures that are infected by each other's actions. And that kind of a practice, sometimes has meant that in a very harsh meetings, I don't have any because that's something that I feel that I just react on those situations. I don't have a big plan or that study that I could say that this is how I do it. I can say in afterwards what happens. But for instance, quite many times when I'm being in the meetings that somebody has asked me to join in a very conflict or hostile negotiations about the nature resources or their use, it seems to be my role to somehow ridicule the authority, to strip up the hostility or the power, the assumed power from that situation, and thus uplift our own community, that they are able to speak their own truths, or they're able to use their voice because they don't feel inferior. And it can go also vice versa. And I also try to work as much as possible within the Sami communities with women, since they are the ones who are mostly taking care of the kids, and also with the kids, to how to increase the feeling of growing will of life, how to increase life in your body, how to do it in a way that is not threatening, that is mild, and that is not too invasive. That is something that basically I'm using the very kind of exercises that are very not that unique from the theater or performative arts scene, and I put them in the real life situation, because I know within myself that, especially I think everybody who has started within the performative arts know that what kind of healing elements there are landing in your body. But it's very rare that those kind of, at least in my communities, that those kind of practices are brought into, for instance, negotiation tables or lives of reindeer herders or so forth. And everything I do is trying to increase the life within that traditional system. And obviously it has come with a huge network of different kind of experts or artists. There clown Laura Rämä, for instance, who had kept clownery to workshops in order to just give tools to see situations, without any prior meanings, any prior attachments, see the world with your fresh eyes as you would see it for the first time. And that can be a very powerful situation in very conflicted societies, to be able to, at least for a while, to see situation with less burdens. Or working with, we just came yesterday from Västerbotten, where we were 2 weeks working with Katja and Berit Haarla and Satu Herrala, and making just bodily exercises to understand where your spine and where your body is now, where the body is, how it is feeling in different landscapes. And like I said, that is very useful for the dancers, but it's not very useful for the Sami dvojars, the handicraft maker. Because it seems to be that in Western art, there's this fear or close circle that are doing the high art. They have the possibility to take care of their own body and your mind and health. And then the rest of the society is somehow excluded from that knowledge. And building that kind of a bridges is something that I try to do. And for some reason, they go hand in hand with the process of starting to undo the man-made damages on the lands for the forests or the waters.
It's basically intersectionality in practice, understanding the interconnectedness of the beautiful. Thank you very much, Pauliina, and thank you, everyone. And we finish here. Could I just ask you, because you started this conversation speaking in Skjold Sami language, that if I'm correct, is 300 people speaking in the world?
Yeah, around.
Yeah, roughly. Maybe we can finish also with this, because it's such a privilege to hear this language. Just say something. We would not understand it anyway.
No, me võitti tyhjät näin ja mun päästä pusan tiijit, kun lepet kuultamuu. Ja toimusto puk jäklee miltoon. Tii vaikka työjät semmoisen työi. Tii jiios päikästä ja jiios mähtästä. Ja neesnit, jos kuuvoitettua, niin meistä liinokam odinakai työjit, odinakai rolle tämän työjästä. Ja että tiedä jäppöstä, että tiedä höupjouem, mutta tverttai työjitä. Spässä tiedä.
We're starting now. Rufemi, thank you for being here.
Should I just go? All right. Would appear so.
Yes. Thank you for being here.
Great. All right. So thanks to the organizers of this. Thanks for having me, everyone. What I would like to talk about today are the two directions, or the two groups of directions, I guess, that climate politics could progress in. It seems that we would have to choose between what I would call climate colonialism and what lots of people would call climate reparations. I think those are the broad avenues in front of us. And I want to talk a little bit about why I frame things in this way, and then you'll hear from Moimo, and then we'll get to talk about it. So the usual story about responsibility for climate crisis itself, and to a lesser extent for the responses to the climate crisis, deals with this kind of distribution. Often the data are drawn from annual CO2 emissions, which is useful, very useful data. I think cumulative emissions makes more sense. But for today's purposes, that's really neither here nor there. But this is the kind of map that people think of when they talk about apportioning responsibility for climate crisis and for the response to climate crisis. What I would propose is simply relating that to this other kind of map. This is, of course, a map of the parts of the world that have at some point in the last 5 or 6 centuries or so been under European colonial domination. And this third and final map, which I think of, and lots of scholarship treats as a kind of political and economic consequence of the previous map. So here's roughly the distribution of gross national income, which is closely related to GDP. These are just broad, crude measures of the amount of wealth that exists in different parts of the world. So as you can see on the map, the richer parts of the world are concentrated in Western Europe and North America, with some notable exceptions, including in the Gulf and in South America. Poor parts of the world are concentrated in South Asia and Africa, with some notable exceptions, but Botswana and Libya. but broadly, there's patterns in where wealth and various kinds of political and economic advantages end up in the world. These are all things that are hopefully familiar to all of us. There are different ways that we could explain and relate to these historical and economic facts, but I want to revisit one kind of implication of these political and economic facts that was taken to heart by Nobel laureate economist and philosopher Amartya Sen many decades ago. Amartya Sen studied famines, among other things as well. There are, roughly speaking, two ways that you could explain why famines happen in the modern world. The intuitive way of explaining famines is that it happens when there isn't enough food to go around. So it's a kind of systemic response to shortages in food supply. This is the food availability decline approach to explaining famines. But in the last few centuries, Amartya Sen argued famously that another explanation of famines is the predominant one. He called it the entitlement approach. I'm calling it the political approach. But the basic story is that famines happen when the system fails to secure vulnerable people. A case study for explaining this insight is the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, in which some 3 million people lost their lives. The famine was typically blamed on low rainfall, droughts. Sen argued that food availability was unchanged, and more recent scholarship argued that rainfall actually increased during the relevant years, and that droughts after democratization of India didn't lead to famine. So the conclusion is that British colonial economic policies caused the famine, particularly the policies of the war effort. This was during the Second World War. The lesson is that something that looks at first glance as though it's about the food system primarily turns out not to be primarily about the food system. It turns out to be about the political system that is hooked up to an economic agricultural system. Basically that in times of crisis, the political crisis engendered by the Second World War, the kinds of political systems we built will protect some interests at the expense of other people's interests. And the people who are lowest on the relevant political hierarchies, the colonized, the racially marginalized, indigenous peoples, tend to be those who are sacrificed to secure the interests of people higher up on the relevant political hierarchies, the rich, the white, the socially well-positioned. So I'm first proposing to look at climate change in more or less the same kind of way that Sen looks at famines. So one way that we could try to talk about the dangers of climate crisis is in terms of what is going to happen in natural systems, geological systems, rain, sea level, hurricanes. But a different way of thinking about it would foreground our political systems, our distribution systems. How is money distributed? How are vaccines distributed? Using the example of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently living through. How are various insurance schemes distributed, and how do those distributions turn out to distribute risk? Those kinds of questions. So, taking that approach forward, looking at the climate crisis in that kind of a way, this is something that jumps out at me from current discourse about the climate crisis that I think is more or less on the money. So Philip Alston, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, in 2019 used the term climate apartheid. I'm sure he didn't coin it, but maybe this is the first prominent use of the term. as far as BBC News was aware of. But they explained it as a system where the rich overescape overheating, hunger, and conflict. Seems good enough for me. As I would explain it, climate apartheid is simply the prediction that we can expect a new kind of social division within countries or cities and communities between those who can afford to pay to avoid the worst impacts of climate crisis on their lives. And climate colonialism is just an identical insight on the same scale. So when we're comparing not families or households or individuals, but when we're comparing instead countries or states or indigenous nations with the nearby settler states, we should expect to find balances of power taking on these new political characteristics where they increasingly decide who will be, all things being equal, who will face the worst burdens and risks and impacts of climate crisis and who will avoid them. There are a couple instructive examples that I want to talk about just to give us the flavor of the idea. On the left is a picture of prisoners from Orleans Parish Prison who were evacuated from the Hurricane Katrina that hit the Caribbean and the United States some years ago. During the social aftermath of this crisis in the southern United States and Louisiana, media circulated images labeling Black people as criminal looters. Law enforcement officials were given orders to shoot looters on sight, and white vigilantes murdered Black people with near total immunity. So the social breakdown wasn't a kind of all-purpose general disaster, though it certainly was that. But the way that violence was distributed after the event and the way that aid was distributed was in ways that tracked pre-existing racial hierarchies, pre-existing forms of injustice. Zooming out to the climate colonialism kind of insight, there are some facts that we should be aware of. I'm just going to mention a couple of these. One, that large-scale land acquisitions in the global south, including South America, but most prominently Africa, on the African continent. The state of global markets drives land acquisitions. These land acquisitions can be and seem to already be being made to secure food, water, and energy supply chains for countries and corporations. I have pessimistic guesses about whose food, water, and energy security will be managed by the acquisitions that are happening across the African continent and South America and Asia. I don't think it will be for the security of African population, because these things are managed. So again, just a reminder of the basic way of thinking about things. It's not just or even primarily what the rain and the wind are doing, but it is how our political systems respond to things like movement. When people are displaced by climate events, whether it is nationalism and xenophobia that governs how states respond at borders in the event that the migration, the displacement is across borders. It is about who is aided and so on and so forth. So the choices that we have in recognition of the ways that injustice later in this century will respond to the kind of structural injustices that we already have is the choice between climate colonialism and climate reparations. The present political situation represents what all political situations do, the accumulated balance of power between the ruling class and the rest of people. Climate reparations is about redistribution of wealth, of course, but also of decision-making power, and perhaps most crucially for climate politics in particular, the benefits and burdens of just transition. Just transition from this current energy system's fossil fuel intensive to a renewable focused energy system. Broadly speaking, climate reparations would be a historically informed distribution of burdens and benefits. The burdens would be towards the global north and advantaged populations, not just high emitters. That's the main difference from the kind of status quo climate politics that I'm human for, I suppose. And the benefits of just transition, of renewable transitions, should likewise go towards the global south, towards Black and Indigenous populations, even ones in the global north. And this is the ethical standard I'm proposing for climate policy. So below this first paragraph, I've just listed major categories of climate policy. And if you have read up a little bit about climate policy, you probably know that in most of these categories, things are being distributed in the opposite way. The global south is taking on the lion's share of the burdens, and to the extent that there are benefits to these, as there are for many of these categories of climate policy, those are being concentrated in the global north. So from here, I'm just going to mention a few things that fit under the redistributive kind of rubric that I've laid out, just so that we can talk about them. One is the Green Climate Fund, which is a UN vehicle for funding for high-income countries, funding green development in low-income countries. As Mariama Williams from the South Center, a researcher from the South Center, once explained in a policy brief, the initial target was an order of magnitude too low, and too much of the funding is coming via loans, creating debt. So there's both quantitative and qualitative problems with the Green Climate Fund. But it does at least represent some kind of redistributive impulse, and maybe that's something we should lean into. But maybe we don't like the Green Climate Fund, or maybe we just don't like some of the other institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and we need new ones entirely. That's something that's been proposed by Keston Perry in 2020, and something that I think deserves a lot of serious thought. Additionally, the global tax situation is atrocious, as we saw in the recent Pandora Papers leak. Global minimum corporate tax would go a long way to rebalancing power in ways that are important and redistributing wealth in ways that are also important. So too would debt cancellation, which is a common call made for by those who call for reparations for racial injustice, slavery, and colonialism. That would include the Caribbean Reparations Commission, Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, both of which are contemporary organizations, as well as older Pan-African formulations like the Abuja Proclamation of 1994. It's also debt for climate swaps. It's something that people have talked about and debated back and forth. I just want to mention two other things just for the sake of having them in discussion. We can actually redistribute political decision-making power directly. I think when people think about democracy, they default to thinking about representative democracy, but there are, of course, more direct methods. For example, in Brazil, there was a method of budgeting called participatory budgeting, which brought public funds under direct public control in something like a town hall format. closely related to this are other ideas like citizens' assemblies or representative democracy by sortition or random selection rather than by election. And all of these are ways to give publics more direct power in what happens to their resources and how their world is structured. And I think those are the kinds of things that also need to be part of climate reparations as a discussion. And while we're on the democracy subject, there's something one could call energy democracy or community ownership of power or community control of power. In many parts of the world, utilities are investor-owned and operate by externalizing environmental costs, so basically socializing the costs and burdens of production and privatizing the benefits in the form of profit and shareholder value. This is politically pernicious, and meaningful public control, which would include state control, but would also have to include meaningful democratic operation within the state and worker representation and unionization. But meaningful public control could be another path that redistributes decision-making power and political power directly and not just money. And these are things that I think should also be part of climate reparations conversations, both in the Global South and in the Global North. I'm going to stop there for now so that we can hear from someone who isn't me. I'm looking forward to what Moemo and the rest of you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Femi. Good to see you. Yes, thank you for the reminder. I'm supposed to be using a microphone. Hi, Femi. Good to see you. It's kind of a little confusing of sort of where to look. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think a really valuable kind of immediate throwing us into thinking through some of the other spaces of conversation around what to do next that emerge from a different kind of, I suppose, intellectual and historical background, and really offer us I suppose another voice than the one that we're often hearing, which is so focused on sort of techno fixes and kind of CO2 focused approaches, but that are not particularly concerned with systemic change. Maybe by way of a kind of immediate response to this, I think that there's a kind of key thing that this raises, which is a question that I often in my mind have this idea that when people like you start to speak of colonialism, the Bengal famine, perhaps racism, sexism, and add this all into the climate sort of conversation, it can feel incredibly overwhelming. It can feel like this is already such a massive crisis. We don't know how to solve it. We're on the verge of extinction, and now you want us to solve the history of colonialism as well. I think this is an important thing to face. And the way that I sort of understand what you and others who might call it sort of a decolonial or intersectional or sort of informed from the Global South sort of discourse on climate change, I think invite us to do is in many ways to be bold and to be very brave about the kinds of approaches we want to take. And I think some of the approaches you've shared with us today are these kinds of, they look like global policies, but what they are is a demand for bravery, I think. And I mean this in the sense that when faced with the question of why throw all of these sort of additional elements into the climate change chaos, the obvious answer is because they're connected. as you so clearly indicate with the Bengal famine example. But the other reason is because I think we come from a long-held history of small fixes, tiny interventions to try and sort of ameliorate, but mostly to keep consequences at bay. And so whether it be kind of buying an electric car or buying offsets that kind of outsource the care and accountability for repair and care for the earth, but enable me to continue to engage in destructive behaviors, or perhaps flying a little bit less. These are all small sort of patched solutions, right? They're not engaging with the real core of the issue. And I think what you call us to do is to be really brave and to engage with the core of the issue and to think about solutions that might begin to address that. One of the things that I think becomes really important when thinking about how we might do this is a question of accountability. And you've already, in your maps, started to sort of infer this and reference this. And I do quite a lot of work around restitution of African heritage. In fact, my kind of work on land and nature and my work on museum practice and restitution are deeply connected. I come to both of them through each other. And there's a quite interesting point made by Achille Mbembe in one of his many talks here in Germany that I've only seen on YouTube. He's talking about restitution of African heritage, and there are effectively two parts to the restitution of African heritage. The one is the need to, on the African continent, repair, reconnect, and recreate culture and knowledge and self. On the other hand, the point of restitution of African heritage is what's often referred to as a renegotiation of the ethics of relation, in this case between Africa and Europe. And Achille's kind of, I'm going to misquote him here, statement is what Africa has learned over hundreds of years is that Europe has a problem with the truth. Europe struggles to tell the truth. And I think this is quite a useful framework to encounter this question of bravery again, which is a matter of needing to be honest with ourselves about where we are and how we've gotten to this point. And that kind of truth-telling and ability to kind of accept that truth is necessary in order to fully recognize that in some senses the climate issue that we face at this moment feels very much like we can no longer keep the consequences of our histories at bay. We can no longer patch with simple solutions. If we face the truth, we know that we need systematic, substantial change that addresses all of these multiple histories. And I think that in some ways you present that in a very kind of systematic, quite accessible way. But then you also bring to us a number of potential strategies for solutions here, either through the participatory budgeting or the kind of global policies that really speak to, on the one hand, just the realities of how we're here, why we're here, the realities of the fact that we're going to need to take full accountability for how we've arrived at this point, and that the kind of historical world that we've created has been, and Femi's spoken to this so well, based on the few benefiting on the basis of not just the backs of, but the destruction of everything else. And it is that structure, effectively, that we face at this point, if we're honest with ourselves. Now, Femi, kind of in relation to that, one of the things that you present to us are these kind of large global policy solutions, which can feel very big, very kind of large structural issues. But then you also present to us some of these kind of more, say, local governance sort of approaches, things like participatory budgeting. One of the things that does become really difficult to deal with in the face of the climate crisis is this kind of issue of scale, right? The little person who can drink through paper straws and buy an electric car, and then these huge kind of massive global requirements. Can you talk to us a little bit about working across these scales that becomes so necessary to kind of imagine at these very global levels, but also what the kind of local might offer us and how we might move beyond straws and electric cars to inform a kind of practice that maybe links more greatly to what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think that's a really, this is a really key question and theme that I think we're all trying to think through. I mean, all those of us who, who are thinking and working around these issues, right? For me, something that I didn't mention, but that I think is at the heart of what I think about this scale question is a movement that is resurgent in US labor politics called the Bargaining for the Common Good movement. And in a way, it's just a kind of reclamation of things that are more that elsewhere in the world are already normalized in union politics, I suppose. But what the Bargaining for the Common Good movement is in the US, it's folks saying, we're going to include more than just workers in our generation of contract demands. So when the union goes to negotiate with the employer about what the contract is, we're going to fight for wages and benefits, but we're also going to fight for other things that are relevant for our community. Historically, that's been a major part of the wave of action against racial apartheid and desegregation here in the United States. Internationally, unions have often fought for things beyond wages and benefits. Unions were crucial parts of the anti-apartheid movement, national independence struggles across the African continent, so on and so forth, right? So bargaining for the common good is, if nothing else, a useful name and way of thinking about what it is that we should want out of these kinds of deeply democratic, at their best, deeply democratic formations, right? Which are what unions are. It's what's different about a union and other forms of organization and politics, which are also important, is that unions have power, and they have the kind of power that is recognized and commensurable with the kind of power that makes the world go around, right? Capitalism, right? They can stop production, and that gives them leverage on terms that capitalists can measure, and terms that capitalists are deeply institutionally and often personally invested in. And I think once we start thinking about that kind of organization and that kind of political movement, we're already thinking about something that relates us to scale in ways that we have deep historical ways of understanding. We have examples and ways of knowing how one union local can link up to transnational movements, to national movements. And I think that kind of thinking, that kind of organizing, that kind of working is the sort of thing that's called for in climate politics. And it's the sort of thing that is much harder to discipline by party politics or the kind of technocracy that's happening at COP a week from now, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a place to look for something that can get us from local scale to global scale.
Thanks for that, Femi. Maybe another question just before. I think there might be someone who'd like to add. You've kind of started to reference this, and I know it's some of the other work that you've done, which in these kind of calls for bravery and these sort of really high challenges to how we want to approach this issue, one of the things that I always find kind of place to rely on is the fact that so many have come before us and have faced forms of kind of total catastrophe. I think Paulina in the previous session mentioned that the Sami have already faced the apocalypse. No, the fact that so many have come before us and have kind of been brave enough, but have also built forms, frameworks, structures, thought through forms of ways of dealing with the same structures that in fact lead us here, right? So there are many people who dealt with transatlantic slavery, dealt with colonialism, and have engaged with the impacts of sort of neoliberal structural adjustment policies, for example. And so there is a long tradition that we might build on. And your mention of unions is one such example of that. But I wonder if you would be willing to kind of give us a little bit more of maybe other examples that you think we might be able to build from, particularly as you think around things like reparations. What are some of the spaces that we might draw from to gather some of that bravery, but also utilize very specific kinds of strategies?
You know, I think maybe I'll start with these two examples, because I think this point that you're making is really crucial, both that historically people have experienced apocalypse, and you know, it's the end of the world, but it's also not the end of the world, right? And so, you know, we can reject a kind of hopelessness or a kind of nihilism by reflecting on that. But also the strategic point that you made, right? That we can learn things from how progress was made from these past incidents. In both cases, I want to talk about, in both these examples, I want to talk about the recognition of political opportunity. So in both the Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791, and the general strike of the African-American population, the enslaved African-American population in the United States, there was a willingness to move on the basis of an understanding that a political opening was there. Right. So in the case of the Haitian Revolution, 1791, the French ruling class was in disarray because of the French Revolution that had begun a couple years earlier. In the case of the African-American general strike, the Union Army had begun advancing on the Confederate Army in the United States Civil War. At that time, many of the political elites were not committed to ending slavery. But when the Union Army advanced, hundreds of thousands of African Americans withdrew their labor from the Confederacy and withdrew themselves from the Confederacy, many of whom joined the Union Army to help crush the Confederacy. And them doing that is why the Civil War ended up abolishing slavery. In neither case did the Haitians or the African Americans wait for the elites to have a genuine change of heart and realize that their political emancipation was important and genuinely commit themselves to that. In both cases, what happened instead was the elites did something that the people who were being dominated could use, could exploit. And that's usually the most you get in politics. And it turns out that it's good enough if you're willing to, if you're willing and able to exploit those openings. And I believe in 2021, the extent to which scientific consensus and increasingly elite consensus outside of fossil capital has converged around understanding and acknowledging publicly at least the broad strokes of the needed renewable energy transition, so on and so forth. I believe it's that kind of opening. We don't have to wait for anybody, either the solar capitalists or the fossil fuel capitalists, to genuinely believe in social transformation, to realize that one is possible. And so we should go for it.
Absolutely. I think this is a super helpful point, and it makes me think of a discussion that I encountered last year. It was Adrienne Marie Brown and some others, and it was during the Black Lives Matter upswell. And someone was kind of musing on how extraordinary it was, how mainstream the idea of defunding the police had become just like that. And Adrienne Marie Brown's response was, oh, no, that didn't just happen. We've been planning for it. We've been preparing for it. And that the point of our organizing is that when the moment happens, when the gap opens, as you say, we're ready. And I found that an incredibly kind of framing and structuring device for myself, that even when it may seem like you are organizing to nowhere or up against a wall, there may at some point be a crack in that wall, and when that crack opens, you want to be ready. You certainly don't want to face that crack and not have spent your time bringing people together onto the same agenda. We have one question from the audience, and I think that'll be our last one. We'll get you to respond, and then we'll close there. I'm going to hand you the microphone. I don't know how far it goes. Do you want to come?
Oh, yeah, I'll come. Hi. I'm Melanie Valencia. I don't know if you can see me, from Ecuador, PhD scholar in this type of work, actually. And I had a couple of follow-up questions. One of the things that I have 3 questions. I guess you can only answer one, so you can pick your favorite. So when you talked about the redistribution of benefits and burdens, there is this concern regarding how we will have to descale. Right? So it's not about only redistributing the benefits and getting people to this ideal of development, but rather we all have to descale, and how to manage these expectations, not at the political level, but rather in terms of our own expectations for life, right? And because I've worked with waste pickers in Ecuador, and I am myself Ecuadorian, I feel like we go beyond this. It's very hard to go beyond this assumption in which we are trapped for our ideals of what it is to be well. And it is this ideal of having these European and US standards. So if we are thinking about redistributing benefits and burdens, we also have to redistribute this ideal. And I don't know how that we could become to even approach it. So that's my first question. Second question is, how do we manage participatory budgeting always sounds great in paper, but I've participated in some of these, and it really can become a full-time job, and you would need to have a lot of knowledge in finance and a bunch of other things. So how are we preparing from for everyone to truly be participatory, like for a budget to truly be participatory. And in that regard, you talked about some of the solutions as creating new institutions, and I do wonder if perhaps it is the role of a new institution to do such work. Do you think there might be a role for peer-to-peer systems and perhaps, you know, what is growing in blockchain and cryptocurrency for also transparency? So 3 questions. Thanks for a great talk.
Thank you. I'll try to respond quickly to each of them. So going backwards, I think there probably is a role for cryptocurrency in building new institutions. I don't think that I know enough about cryptocurrency to say more than that, but I don't see why not. Maybe I should put it that way. For the second question, I think the success of participatory budgeting depends on how many resources are put towards participatory budgeting in 2 senses. One, how much of the city or county budget as a percentage is being governed by participatory processes, and relatedly, how much advisory support in terms of the kind of technical support that lawmakers would get, the participatory processes are getting. So you get wildly different responses based on cases like Seville, which gave 4% of its city budget to participatory processes, versus Kerala, which redefined the state in India, which restructured its entire budgetary processes around participatory budgeting. Or Sao Paulo, the original place where more than half of the city budget was dedicated to these processes, right? It is a full-time job, and so you need to hire full-time workers to make sure that these processes can actually happen. And so you have to genuinely commit to this as a new form of governance, as opposed to an add-on to an existing form of governance. So I totally agree there are practical challenges, but they seem overcomable. And then the first question about design, I don't think we should be using European standards, or we shouldn't use them because they are European standards. But part of the work that we should be doing, and part of the reason why these processes should be participatory, is that we should be deciding what the standards should be. I'm not sure that everyone is going to have to descale. I think much of the world uses far less resources than those of us in the global north. But I do think everyone deserves a different world than we have now. If that means that the relevant measures aren't income, but are, say, doctor to patient ratios, in which the global standard would be Cuba rather than the United States, for instance, I don't see any reason why we couldn't or shouldn't do that kind of rethinking alongside the other kinds of political restructuring that we need to do to remake the world. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thank you for those questions, and thank you to you, Femi, for being so generous with your thoughts and ideas. I mean, I think that those last questions are very much questions of imaginary. And I think we all know we have a lot of work to do. And it's always wonderful to be around people willing to do that work. So thank you very much for all of your time. And thank you to everyone in the room. We'll close there.
Thanks, everybody.
So thank you for staying with us. I already said at the very beginning that we will end this day with poems by Naomi Ortiz, who lives in the Mexican and US-American borderlands. Naomi fights for climate and eco-justice and social justice, just as well as for disability justice. For her, the effects of climate change and the climate crisis are always linked to her social position and condition as a disabled person. In an essay she wrote for another theatre festival here in Germany, she says, if one is afraid of being vulnerable, how does one adapt? Disabled people know that living into the future means learning to ask for help, to be patient, flexible, and insistent. To provide help is to be in a place of having resources, time, or energy to share. To give respectful help is a process in becoming aware of our own capacity in the moment. It takes practice to know providing help isn't always convenient, and boundaries can also exist. Grappling with interdependence necessitates slowing down, listening, disappointing each other, and mending. Naomi isn't able to be here tonight, but we are ever more happy than that Erwin Aljukic, actor and member at the Münchner Kammerspiele, the city theatre here in Munich, is able to read a few poems by Naomi Ortiz as a last note for us today. You are an actor, but also a member of the organization Art But Fair. And this is just one of your engagements among others. Erwin will read 3 poems by Naomi, one Rebellious Resistance, then Hard Medicine for Mountain Scars, and the 3rd poem, Invitation. So I'll pass over.
Thank you for these words, Mana, which really touched me because it says a lot. Yes. And honestly, it's a big honor for me and a pleasure to represent Naomi here and her poems. Because, as you mentioned right now, yes, I'm artist, I'm dancer, actor since 23 years. And since I began, and this is why I do identify myself with her, since I began with my career, in whatever I do, if it's working for TV or if I'm on stage or whatever I do professionally, I never can split that of being, so I'm an artist, but there is also the fact being a person with a disability. So I never can split that. And these 2 elements always go together, even if I don't verbalize disability on stage or on TV, but just the fact being a person with a disability on stage or in front of a camera is already a political statement. And I'm always aware of that. And so I don't have to play and to use my disability in my work. But Naomi is using that. And but for a certain purpose. I will tell you then afterwards in which ways. And when we're talking about disability or people with a disability, we have to talk about a lack of accessibility, which you have as a person with a disability in many, many fields, that you don't have equal opportunities, that you do have in many aspects of life the lack of accessibility. So this can lead, this unfairness, I would say, to a certain anger and frustration. But these emotions can lead to something for a kind of engine, that with this anger and frustration, this can be an engine for you to be rebellious and to do something with that. And the first point is called rebellious resistance. Bass booms opposite my scooter rattles. I am obstruction. I am insurgent crip here, braced for the right to exist as I am. And mestizo living for the music just as much as a screaming Chicana next to me. Security glares at wheel inched into ale, attempt to blow them, a kiss gets eyebrows pulled together. Inward crinkle, face sour, as they reach out and show forward. Scoot as he tries to fold me down into no consent, no personhood. They try and move me into accessible spot, too small. No way to scream over pounding rhythm to find about lack of access. Attention hangs on degree of breaking the rules. I am pity offender, they move on. Squeezed between stage and bouncing bodies, I try to surrender, to touch, braced against hard plastic to shield, fat body grip. My earrings swing and catch the light. Insert self into swarm of crowd. And body, breathe machine. Close my eyes and inhale. I exist by defiance. Here, on the bus, at the store, on Dr. exam table, sitting at father's kitchen counter. I live on love. I live on anger. I live on no longer giving a shit. I live by sweaty swaying face to face with men in charge to confront, persist for civil rights. The question of what I can tolerate before needing relief, some days it's personal. Disquiet, inner turmoil, frustrated tears. Some days are all right. Feels them I'm entitled to be here too. Some days even armor can't keep me safe. House lights come up. I wait for the crowd to clear. Drunken, coal-lined eyes blink at me. Awkward movement around. My scooter, her cane, his unbending legs, with change in light. We go from threat to once again invisible. Even as security urges me, move, move. Even as trash is swept away, we who remain, our difference is diversity. And protecting diversity is the only way to ensure survival of everything. And what I found very interesting is, so what I've said before, I, as a person with a disability, I don't use that disability. But this is what she's doing. She uses being a disabled person, but not to talk about herself, but more for another purpose, and to compare these it's a hard word, vulnerability, right? Her vulnerability and that pain she experienced in her life, and which many persons with a disability do experience in life. So indeed, physical pain. But she's not talking about herself. She uses that as a kind of symbol to underline, to emphasize the world's pain, the vulnerability of our world. And this she's doing in the poem, Heart Medicine for Mountain Scars. Because here I have to say that one sentence is very, when we come to climate change. So it is important to say that climate change and all the effects do bedrohen, how you say, threaten or do have a bigger impact for persons with a disability. And here, this sentence is says a lot. It's not from her, but which shows, the impact of climate change when it comes to rights of people with a disability. Disabled people's vulnerability isn't simple a body problem. It's a political problem, a political failure. And that is why here, in that poem, she's making comparison. Her disability with, you can say, the world's disability or the nature's disability or the pain. They call you big, fire, horn, scar. Now we share more in common than one-sided. Childhood, want for study, teenage neglect or need, elder-designed guardian of consistency. Now we share something happened to us. Ripped through, for you, centuries grown plants and soil, for me, generations of ancestral grown skin and bone, both procedures unique, not easy. We know how to be fierce, tie our roots to ever-shifting plate tectonics. We share beauty, cloud wisps created through our valleys, drops of rain which come too fast. They call me deformed. I could never find shoes. Junior high nickname of crippled bitch. Anesthesia mask held unyielding over my mouth by man's hands as I backed through the plastic and gas for just one unencumbered minute to prepare. Words fail to hold enough nuance of being split, open sideways, shuffled around, fondled from inside. No pain scale number to describe teeth, shattering fire, which lasts for months. Numb is not the absence of pain. It's the description of void, where one sits to examine the tender bits held untouched. But as I said before, having just that feelings of anger and frustration is not enough. So you can be rebellious and verbalize problems. But what then? What do you do with that? So there must be a step further. And that means, yeah, of course you can verbalize things, but then you have to show or open up eventual solutions. And you have to maybe open up new horizons. So having the courage to go further. And but it is very difficult just going further and have the strength to do something when it's too intellectual, because then you don't have the power. You lose your power. But what you need is really being able to feel what is there, what am I feeling, being able to be empathic. And this is the very most important thing, being empathic, and then from out of that, to understand the pain of somebody. And then also to go ahead, because you feel you are present in the present. And it is important to invite people to open up new horizons, and also to invite them to feel what's now here. Where am I right now? Who are you? How are you feeling? And in the poem Invitation, she talks about that. Sand expands as rain pounds into earth, soaking, absorbing, getting soft. This is the moment when life has a chance. Water surges down riverbeds, which minutes ago lay barren and dry, seeds battered by rocky soil, sense spaciousness below them, seize the moment to sand our roots. Spring forth shoots. The dark stillness of underground becomes full of surprises as scorpions and centipedes drawn by rain trek from hidden burrows beneath the surface through downpour and wind, chaos and change. Find their way to each other to dance and mate. The desert knows the best times for undress desire. The rolling monsoon storm draws us to the porch. I like to go to the edge to be within kissing distance of danger. You prefer the cozy confidence of shelter, staying close to the door. Case of storm rattles the window panes, awakens my senses. Scent of creosote soaks into my tongue, throat and lungs. Makes me want to just breathe deeper. Watching rainbuck and twist till it slaps to the ground, This release of building tension looses our tongues, wakes up from the labor of being, drowsiness of heat startles us into now. A sudden drop in temperature, wind runes cold through my hair, makes me remember how much my fingertips love to feel you. I caress the crease of an elbow, the sun-stained skin etched on the back of your neck. Urgency crackles wet, crashes into my body, unsheathes a bit of joy. I had tucked inside, somehow today, we found each other in the middle of this chaos, and change possesses this moment to cherish soft tenderness of flesh greeting moisture. The desert knows the best time to undress desire. Thank you.
Thank you for the beautiful reading. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you at the premiere, Munich premiere of The Drying Prayer, if you're going there tonight. The show can happen. So thanks for coming. Have a good evening.